talk briefly about why this event is so important tonight, both in a very broad context and then for our BJ community specifically as well. So we have seen in recent years record numbers of homelessness in our shelter systems, both for single individuals and for families. We have seen lows of people being able to move out of our shelter system into permanent housing. And we've seen record numbers of people surviving on the streets and on the trains in our city. Back in March, we watched as shelters, which already had inhumane conditions, then became incredibly unsafe amidst a global pandemic. And while the rest of the city was ordered to socially distance and stay at home, none of that was possible for our neighbors who were living in shelters or on the streets. Homeless individuals really led the fight for months before the city finally agreed to move folks from those congregate shelters into hotel rooms. And even then, those rooms were often shared between perfect strangers. And during the pandemic, we saw for many months move outs from the hotels into permanent housing came to almost a complete halt. And then just a few months ago, the city announced that they would be moving most of those folks who were in hotel rooms back into congregate shelters. And that was despite the fact that the vaccination rate amongst homeless New Yorkers was lower and is lower than the citywide average, despite the fact that most of us, in the general public, were not yet allowed back into our own gyms and city theaters, despite the fact that the Delta variant was and is still surging, despite the fact that the federal government had agreed to reimburse the city for paying for those hotel rooms through September 30th, a date we haven't even hit yet. And despite the fact that housing vouchers in the city still remain incredibly inadequate for finding affordable permanent housing. And that I think Shams will talk a little bit about, because a bill, as many of you might have heard, was recently passed to raise the city vouchers. And that bill, for folks who might not be familiar, actually sat in city council for 3 years untouched before it was finally voted on just a few months ago. And for folks who have been surviving on the streets before the pandemic and during the pandemic, we saw excessive policing and street sweeps where people's belongings were thrown away, often with little to no notice, and minimal services being offered. And of course, I know that nothing I'm telling you is likely news to you, because we all saw this play out in our own neighborhoods and our own communities and on the news across the city. And I'm sure Shams will share more about these experiences as well. So tonight is the fourth night of Sukkot. It's a week-long holiday, for those who might not know, where the Jewish people are commanded to dwell in the sukkah, which is a temporary structure that we build outside. At BJ, we would be in a sukkah that we built on our roof if we were in person there tonight. And that's a reminder of the years that the Jewish people wandered in the desert after leaving Egypt without stable homes. And all of the normal things we usually do in our houses year round, we're told we should do them in the sukkah during Sukkot. And for those of us lucky enough to have stable and dry and warm permanent homes, the exposed sukkah is of course a lot less comfortable. And I just think it's worth taking a moment to sort of acknowledge the fact that, and I'm sure this has crossed many of our minds, the fact that, for tonight's event, to learn about homelessness in an outdoor shelter at BJ, when the forecast, looked bad and we decided it really wouldn't be safe to gather in person together on a roof with no, covering, those of us with permanent homes were able to stay in our homes and Zoom in to this event, and thousands of our neighbors do not have that choice. So at BJ, we have operated a respite bed shelter in close partnership with the Church of St. Paul and St. Andrews for many years. That shelter has been on pause since March, as have all of the city's faith-based respite beds because of the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you on this call, many of our members and SPSA members over the years have really sustained that shelter through hours and hours and hours of volunteering and service and managing and running that program. And I think it's worth acknowledging that having a faith-based, small, 10-bed respite shelter 5 nights a week is incredibly meaningful and important and necessary in the current world that we live in. And I also believe that maintaining a shelter, a 10-bed shelter, cannot and should not be all that we do as members of BJ and citizens of the city to be part of the fight to end homelessness and housing insecurity in New York. BJ and all of the folks on this call and our very close partners and our community is big and well established and vibrant. And I hope that we all can sort of put that collective energy and passion and sometimes righteous anger into the broader advocacy and organizing work that's being led every day in the city by current and formerly homeless New Yorkers. And we're really lucky that Shams is joining us here tonight to sort of share his experiences and his knowledge about lots of these issues with us. And I think we have a lot to learn together. And so just a note, and I'm wrapping up shortly, on sort of the future of our shelter, which I imagine many of you have been a part of and might be interested in being part of again. We previously were working with a different shelter provider. Going forward, we are exploring and in talks with a new shelter provider who would be our partner. They are called Paul's Place, and they are run by CUCS, the Center for Urban Community Solutions, which is a very well-respected organization here in the city. They are a new shelter placement themselves, and they'll also have 24-hour safe haven services. They hope to open sometime in the next few weeks, and we hope that if the need is there and we can meet the safety requirements, that we'd be able to open sometime shortly thereafter. And so many of you who probably were volunteers before might have received a survey from me recently to gauge how you might feel about returning to volunteering in our shelter. And I would just encourage, and I'll say this again at the end, if anyone leaves here tonight and says, I definitely want to be involved either in the reopening of our shelter or of course in some of these broader advocacy and organizing efforts, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email on the chat, and it should have been on the page that you, the website page that you went to sign up for this event. So that was a sort of long spiel. I am going to hand it over to Shuli to take it away for some teaching.
Great, thank you, Kiana, and good evening, everyone. Want to thank everyone for their flexibility in shifting. I do want to invite folks who do not have their video on, if you do have the possibility of turning on your video to do that. We wanted to be in person. We had hoped we would be sitting around the sukkah, seeing each other's faces, and Zoom gives us the ability to do that if we turn our video on. So not everyone has that capacity, but if you do, I'd love to see your faces so we can get more of a sense of the community that's joining for this event. Thank you so much for that. I want to just add a little bit of Jewish text and framing to Kiana's beautiful introduction. And one of the things that I was going to note is relates to the weather tonight. The Mishnah, which is an early 2nd century rabbinic text, where a lot of Jewish ritual practice today comes from, teaches that on the holiday of Sukkot, which is happening right now, the 15th of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, that on the holiday for 7 days, a person should make their sukkah their permanent residence and make their house a temporary residence. And the very next sentence is, if rain falls, if it starts to rain, when can you leave the sukkah, right? Meaning the Mishnah assumes that, like, actually, if the weather is bad, you can leave your sukkah. And it says, from the time that it's raining so hard that it starts to spoil your food, and which is probably less than it was even raining tonight, certainly in some parts of New York City. And I think there's something that is both realistic and compassionate about that, and also, in a sense, should trouble us, because if the goal of this holiday, or if one of the goals of this holiday is to really experience a shelter that is temporary, that is impermanent, that is somewhat flimsy, with a roof that's made of sticks and branches and leaves, and walls that are made of wood or canvas, certainly nothing as permanent and as sturdy as most of our homes. If the purpose is to sense that vulnerability by stepping outdoors and being in a temporary space, a vulnerable space that we have made in our minds permanent, we're actually get to undo some of that a little bit if we go inside when it rains. As soon as we become too uncomfortable in the elements, too uncomfortable in our vulnerability, in our exposure to discomfort, we can just go back inside. And I think that should spur us to think a little bit, as Kiana said, about the ways in which those of us who have homes to go into can do that during this holiday, or any time that it rains, when we feel a bit uncomfortable, and how many people really do not have that resource. Not going to call it a luxury, because it's not a luxury. It's a basic right and a basic need for human existence. But I want to say something else from the tradition about this holiday, and why I think this is a very appropriate time for us to be learning more about the situation, the status of homelessness and housing in New York City, and talking about please God, the reopening of the shelter, and also the ways that we can be involved in advocacy work and organizing work that's happening. And that is to say that this notion of arai, of impermanence, is connected in the Jewish tradition with the notion of joy. Sukkot is the holiday where the Torah, where the Bible specifically says you should be joyful on this holiday. And it has become known, this Sukkot, as the time of our joy. That is how it's referred to, how this holiday is referred to in the liturgy. And I think that opens up the question for us of what does it mean to say that the time when we're supposed to experience vulnerability is supposed to be the time when we are most joyful? I don't know that most of us would associate vulnerability with joy, whether that's physical vulnerability or emotional vulnerability. And what I think one way, there are lots of different ways that this connection has been interpreted in the Jewish tradition. But one idea that I want to bring forward tonight is remembering that this is a holiday that has come after the Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we have brought in a new year. We have done a lot of spiritual work of thinking about who are we and who are the people we want to be in the world, and what is the world that we want to live in. And there is a vulnerability, a spiritual vulnerability, in coming to that place of recognizing and openly, honestly acknowledging, I'm flawed. The world is flawed. I've made mistakes. The world has made mistakes. Things need to be different. And to do that work, when we actually open up to that reality and are vulnerable in that way, we can be transformed. That is what this holiday is teaching us, that we can have in that moment of vulnerability a sense of moral imagination, that things can be transformed into joy, into the deepest joy that's possible. And what I think that means for this context, particularly what we're going to hear about this evening, and hopefully more opportunities to be involved in going forward, is that when we open our eyes to the vulnerability that exists, it becomes our religious, spiritual mandate to do that work of transformation and believe that transformation is possible and be part of that transformation. And that's what we know needs to happen in this world. And that's what we know needs to happen in ourselves. And as Kiana said, we want to provide the immediate resource of beds and shelter, respite shelter. And we also want to be part of seeking true transformation, of turning vulnerability into joy, of opening our eyes, of saying, here's where things are not right. Here's where mistakes have been made, or here's where we haven't gotten it right. We need to make things different. We need to move toward that place of joy and be transformed and be part of transformation. And that is, I think, the deeper meaning, or one of the deeper meanings of Sukkot, of this holiday. And I hope a teaching or an idea that we can take as inspiration as we hear some of the history of the BJSPSA shelter, and also some of the realities of what's going on in our city, so that we ourselves can be moved to be part of that transformation, that ultimate transformation that we really, really are seeking. So with that, I want to turn it over to Reverend Kay Carpin, who's the senior pastor at the Church of St. Paul and St. Andrew, and was involved from the very beginning in the opening of the shelter and the partnership that B'nai Jeshurun has had with SPSA. So Kay, over to you for a little history.
Thanks, Julie. I always learn from you, Julie, and tonight was no exception. I'm going to, as you said, give a little history. It's an almost 35-year journey that we've been on, and most of it together. I'll try to hit a couple of high points, and maybe it's informative. I was thinking as Julie was talking about transformation, of being transformed and then leading to some transformation in a larger world and larger society. That's been a lot of my experience on not only the issue of homelessness, but getting involved in providing space. I think back to the late 80s when, I'll speak for our congregation, we were a little bit overwhelmed by the homelessness crisis. I don't always like the word crisis, because that assumes that it's like something that's acute and happening, and then we can figure out a way to fix it and then move on to the next crisis. But as I think Shams could tell us, and Corinne Lowe could tell us, this is an ongoing situation and a structural situation that persists. So, but we were young and naive, and we were faced with a situation all around the West Side and all around New York City and beyond, where people were not housed. People were living out on the streets in all kinds of weather. And we were wringing our hands, and I know at St. Paul and St. Andrew, like, what can we do? What can we do? We got into some conversation, workshops. What does a religious organization do? Like, we have workshops about things. And I remember Mark Greenberg, who runs the Homelessness Awareness Center and was an activist back then, saying, like, well, one thing you could do, I mean, you have this building, you could provide a safe, dry place for people to live. So we were like, oh, I guess we could do that. And B'nai Jeshurun was going through a similar situation on their side. I'll get to that in a second. But I just remember how naive we were. And the people who started this, but one of them's my spouse, Charlene, and Bill Phillips, who was a member of the congregation at the time. They said, okay, we're going to take this at hand, we're going to make it happen. But none of us knew what we were doing. And had we ever really sat down and had a conversation with somebody who wasn't housed, who was trying to live in that situation? And I think the answer was probably no, not really. And so But we forged ignorantly ahead and worked out an arrangement through Partnership for the Homeless, which under the Dinkins administration was tasked with providing some respite shelter beds in religious communities around the city. And so we said, okay, we can create some space one night a week, Saturday night. We got about 40 volunteers from the church involved in this project. And but we were so not ready when, we had some beds, we had, but I remember that first night when the 10 men arrived to make a home very temporarily in our very large and kind of dank church basement, that we didn't know what we were doing. And the guys came in and they were like, they sensed that. And they were like, that's okay, we got this, we got this, we got this. So here, and we followed their lead, big important learning right there. And we were able, with their help, to create a space where people could sleep. This was in 1988. And the shelter continued one form or another ever since until this pandemic. Very sad moment. I think I slept overnight downstairs in the last night we were able to have the shelter. Okay, as I said, parallel to this, B'nai Jeshurun also in that period, the late 80s, was starting a shelter also in connection with this city initiative through Partnership for the Homeless. And I remember going to the shul one Shabbat, and Marshall Meyer standing up, and Marshall Meyer was one of the rabbis back then, blessed memory, and Marshall saying in a very booming and prophetic voice, a synagogue that doesn't have a homeless shelter, it can't call itself a synagogue. Call yourself something else. So lo and behold, BJ and AJ should started a shelter too. Now, I'll say just like two more things, and then we'll get on to people who know more about this than I do. But the first thing that B'nai Jeshurun and St. Paul and St. Andrew did together was combining our efforts in the shelter, because B'nai Jeshurun was doing some renovation work at the time on 88th Street, on the kitchen and so forth. They couldn't house the shelter. They said, oh, you got one going, there. We could, can we please move our shelter? It was on a different night, or 2 nights maybe, into your space. It was sure. Little did we know that 5 months later, there would be a ceiling collapse on the beautiful sanctuary at 88th Street, and everything from B'nai Jeshurun would move into St. Paul and St. Andrew building for a while. Anyway, we found that we were kind of doing parallel operations, so it became very clear to us, doing the things in the same space, that we just needed to combine forces and work together. And like, if volunteers from our congregation couldn't make it on what was still a Saturday night, well, there were other nights available that BJ was taking the lead on, and vice versa. And so for that next 30 years or so, we did everything together on the shelter. And it's been a pretty powerful and beautiful partnership. And what I've loved over the years, and maybe this is the last thing I need to say, it's been wonderful how many people have gotten involved, and how the emphasis has always been on making people feel at home. Like, this is not a home. We know it's not a home. You deserve a home. And we're going to continue to be involved in the macro sense of tackling the issues that are keeping people from getting housing. But while you're here in our spaces, either at B'nai Jeshurun or at St. Paul and St. Andrew, you are our guests. And what we can do to make this less of a horrible situation for you, we're going to do whatever we can do to make it a gracious situation. One thing I've loved, and this really is the last thing I'll say, is the way different other groups have gotten involved. I remember we have a tutoring program, very active at St. Paul and St. Andrew. Well, this is before the pandemic. And one of the delightful things was seeing the parents of the kids who came for tutoring see the transition that happened right after tutoring to shelter, and they were like, "Oh, well, we love to cook, and we could make meals for the women." By then, it was women at the shelter. And just getting different people involved. The theater that we have here in the building saying, oh, well, the guests are here anyway, we can have a special performance of whatever, in case they would like to come. And I love things like that. And I love working with the nature scientists and everything. And at that, unless people have questions, I think I'll be quiet for a while.
Thank you, Kay. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Shams, but I think first we are going to play a video that Shams requested to start. So I'm going to try to share my screen and just like wave your arms around if there's an issue with the sound. Okay. Okay, can you all see my screen just before I make this full size? Great.
This is my reality. Look where I'm at. Tonight I'm gonna spend the night. I really was trying to do something else. I don't even know how to fake this. I had to really sleep on a bench right to the fishery. You got us in here dying! Either slowly or quickly. Either way, there's no upside to being in this place. This is death for us. Move on this now. Do what is necessary to get people housed. Get them housed now. Usually, we're voiceless and today, we have a seat at the table.
Okay, and Shams, I'm just trying to find your screen.
Hello?
Up. Take it away.
Hear me? All right, give me a second. I'm sorry. So, greetings. First and foremost, let me begin by thanking you all for inviting me to join in this wonderful celebration that begins 5 days after Yom Kippur, Sukkot. Named after booths or huts, it's the time in which Jews are supposed to dwell during this week-long celebration. And I don't know how many of you are in one of those dwellings now, especially since we have a storm coming or is here. But we are here today virtually and in solidarity to celebrate. I get these calls all the time, Jesus Christ. We are here virtually in solidarity to celebrate this week-long celebration. Now, I don't know where you're at now, but on one hand, I would like to enhance our understanding of housing and homelessness. And on the other hand, I would like us to understand what it's like to help those that are less fortunate than we are. I'm honored to be among you, to speak to you and share with you a few words that I would hope impacts you in a positive way. I'm thankful that our blessed Creator has created a bridge for us that allows us to be together during what are still challenging times.
we are not fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic and are still dealing with many things that places us in adverse conditions. Beyond COVID-19, we are also experiencing a challenge when it comes to the issue of climate change. Throughout the world, people are being affected across the board. And because of this, we have to understand the value of unity, of coming together, working as one, to not just survive in this world, but to thrive. So let us rejoice in the fact that you and I are in the same virtual space, communicating and connecting in a healthy and holistic way. That is a testament to our individual and collective growth and development during these difficult times. We are prospering as we journey together along this path towards inner and outer peace. And with that being said, let me greet you all with the greeting words of peace as it is said in Arabic, Assalamu alaikum, in Hebrew, Shalom, and as we in the streets simply say, peace. So last year, I learned about this Jewish celebration of Sukkot, and it was so powerful of a message for me that I literally changed much of my messaging because it centered for me the value of expressing care and compassion to those who are less fortunate. And my understanding, which may be limited, but in that learning process, I saw this celebration as something that really spoke to my own personal experiences, particularly as they relate to the issues of housing and homelessness. You may realize, or may not realize, but I have felt and have spoken of the need for collaboration in addressing the issues of housing and homelessness. From the first time I spoke at Gracie Mansion with those radical ladies, yeah, I call them radical, who called themselves Upper West Siders for Open Hearts. I've tried to center a message that would bring people together and have us work collectively to solve some of the issues plaguing our city during these difficult times. I never sought division. I cared little for ideological differences. But I learned in this celebration that there was something that is called Sukkot. And from what I was learning, I said, oh my, this is it. This celebration centers around all that we need to understand in terms of how we should address each other and how we should work collectively to apply what some people call the golden rule, which says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What you want for yourself, that is which you should want for your brother or for your sister. Your success is my success. And so I've grown in my understanding of how to approach and how to address the issue of housing and homelessness. And I think, if I remember correctly, I'm getting a little older, so some things just doesn't be there like that. But I think that it was young students who invited me to speak and share my experiences during this celebration last year. I know I spoke to Road of Shalom, the school, and I spoke to a group of teens from a synagogue in Westchester.
Mommy?
And what I got from them
Hello?
was, hello? What I got from them was transformative. To know that they built a dwelling that was to symbolize their desire to help someone that may be homeless moved me. I know what it's like to walk those streets of New York City and not have any form of shelter. The trauma of my past is such that I could never forget walking in the cold winter nights, freezing, and as the snow would pour down from the skies, I'd wonder if I would live to the next morning. No shelter, no support, no nothing. I was a child during that time. My mind was not fully developed, but I was being formed in the trauma of that experience. I was growing and developing from the trauma of that experience. And that is why I'm here today. Sukkot allows us all to share that experience. It allows us to develop a sense of empathy, of care, of compassion for those who may be less fortunate than we are. It's a powerful thing that we have to focus on and use to better not just those we want to help, oh no, but to also help ourselves. We can learn from putting ourselves in other people's shoes, so to speak, to get that real life experience, to learn firsthand what this experience, this vulnerability, this reality of lack, of destitution is about. I want you to walk the streets with me for just a moment. It'll never equal to the actual experience. I gotta keep it real. But imagine being 12 years old, walking the gritty streets of New York City during a time when they didn't have a lot of cops, they didn't have cameras all over the place. 40 Deuce was not family land, it was the Deuce for real. You had no place to go in the winter with snow coming down upon you, and you are simply seeking shelter. You go into a building where the door is open, and as you try to get some comfort on a staircase to protect you from the elements, two men approach you and to start to question you. You're a child. You think they're there to help you. But as you listen to their questions, you realize they're trying to lure you into their apartment. But thank goodness you got some street sensibilities. And so you find a way to get out of this dangerous situation. You escape what more than likely would be potential harm. You were in danger. You leave, you go back into the cold with no place to go, probably avoiding rape probably avoiding sex trafficking, probably avoiding death. That's my reality. It's my story. And it is the story of so many people throughout the world. Not just my story, not just the story of people in New York City, but throughout the world. Two of my brothers have joined us today. Raheem Shabazz, who was in a group home with me at the time that I'm describing. Another brother is Malik Shabazz, who lived in a home during that time that I'm talking about. And during that night that I referred to, it was Malik's home that I was trying to get to and find some sense of safety. I was okay in the long run, but I'll never forget the fear, the trauma, the sense of I have nobody to turn to. And I was just 12 years old. So during this celebration, my goal is to have you come and experience that. Have you see and feel what it's like to go through that. And I'm close saying this. I spoke to a reporter yesterday who he asked me, he said, why are you still doing this? You have your place. You should be good with all of the trauma and everything you've been through. Why not just go on with your life? And others have asked that. But I said to him, I'm speaking from what I call trauma-informed activism. I'm speaking because I know how horrible this reality is, and because I care so much for others, I'd be willing to sacrifice everything just so no one else has to go through this experience again. I talk to young people throughout the city and other places, and it is they who really infuse my desire to keep going. Because when I speak to them and I see the intelligence that they have, when I see how in tune they are and how invested they are and how they want so much to have a better world, it is their spirit that infuses me and let me know that we do have some light at the end of the tunnel, that it ain't all gloom and doom. And so in my connection to them, I am able to say, oh man, this is what I was born for. This is why I'm here. And so I say to you, and during this great celebration, which I didn't know existed 2 years ago, but now that I know it existed, you need to understand that it is this thing called Sukkot that has helped to infuse my message. And it came from the youth, from speaking to the children of Rodolph Shalom and speaking in synagogues and doing the soulful walking talks and joining with faith leaders and just us coming in community and saying, let's understand each other. Let's understand, and respect our maybe cultural differences. Let's understand that at the end of the day, we're all humans. We are all humans. Whatever your belief system is, whatever your income level is, we can still coexist in this world and make things better for each other. And so this is such a powerful celebration that I would like to broadcast to the world, because it says, wear my shoes for a minute. See what my experience is like, so you can get a better understanding. You can't get nothing better than that. There was a time I was in the shelters and I didn't talk to nobody. I was in and out. And it wasn't until I started talking to people that I realized these are great people. These are people with great potential. Even I had my stereotypical views on them, and I was in the same situation. But in conversation and communication and talking to them, realized, nah, we all brothers. We all are the same. And so I'm honored to be here. And I love my family, my Jewish brothers and sisters. And you have so much in this and other holidays and experiences and celebrations that the world can benefit from. I have benefited from, that I just hope that we can continue on in solidarity in order to address issues, not just housing and homelessness, but we have issues of wealth inequality. We have issues of racial injustice. Those of us that are Black and brown, particularly those of us that came here many years ago to be slaves. We've never gotten reparations, and a lot of the problems that you see today are the direct result of our slave experience. And so we have to come together to kind of repair those things and work to heal the wounds that have been inflicted upon us in those experiences and those circumstances. But this can't happen just with me and my homies on the block. No, we need everybody to have a seat at the table. My final thing to you is this. When you look at the example that has been set on the Upper West Side, to address a situation where the Black and brown people of the shelter that came into those shelters, that came into the communities, were being demonized, vilified, et cetera, et cetera. It was well-meaning people from the same community that said, we don't agree with that messaging. We welcome you. And so I talk about the Chalk ladies who wrote, welcome, we love you, every person deserves a home, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at the experience, it's no one judges because you represent a different race, group, religion, color, or whatever the case is, sexual identity, gender identity. No, those questions don't get asked and no one cares. It's just we all see each other as humans. And those, what I call radical ladies, embraced us. And I speak of the transformative power of that embracement, which allowed us to come together and do things that change the dynamic of our lives internally and in the shelter run by Project Renewal, but also allowed us to change ourselves. Not just us, the men of the Lucerne, but also those ladies and those who were around them and with them, and many neighbors from the Upper West Side. It's just a testament of how, when we can communicate and we can work together, how we can do things that will positively impact humans and people and those that are in need. And if we can continue this example, then that's a good thing. And in Sukkot, if you are all willing to walk this walk, even if it's for a week, just so you can learn and experience, then I'm sure you would understand why housing is a human right. Housing justice is racial justice. And in your experience, just being Jews and the history of why you celebrate this, you would understand that anyone that you come across who may be less fortunate is worthy of your help, of your compassion, of your care, of your concern. There's an activist named Shaniqua Charles who introduced me to something called privilege lending. And she said, because a lot of the people I speak to, they say, in my privilege, I'm white and I'm privileged. And I said, okay, and I'm following along. And Shaniqua Charles said, no, you better understand something. You also have privilege. And I'm like, huh? No, I'm poor, I'm broke. I'm in the Lucerne. And she said, no. You have the privilege of your experience. You have the privilege of your Black experience. You are privileged too. You may not have money, you may have this, but that doesn't mean that you're not privileged. She says, so what you need to engage in is something called privilege lending. I didn't understand it, but she broke it down. And that's us lending our experience to each other, our resources, whatever the case is, in order to enhance the society that we live in. And so come, learn this experience. And from that, let's collectively work to make sure that we all can benefit in a positive way, so that we're not just surviving in this world, but we're also thriving. Thank you. I appreciate you all. And if you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Shams. I feel like everything you just shared, there's so much powerful information and experiences there. And I have had really the pleasure of knowing Shams now for well over a year and organizing and standing in solidarity together for many things. And I am, every time I hear you speak, Shams, just blown away. And I think a theme that I'm sort of feeling in a lot of what we're hearing tonight is this idea of vulnerability. And I think I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing those vulnerable experiences, especially from your childhood. I think we're thinking about the vulnerability of, what it means to have a temporary shelter for a week, and the vulnerability of all of the folks and our neighbors in New York City who don't have homes, and the vulnerability that we all have within ourselves. And I think both on a internal level and also in a very real sense that I think many of us know that, and it could happen to any of us, right? That we are all capable of experiencing homelessness. It is, and so it's just very important, I think, for us all to humble ourselves and carry that vulnerability with us in any work that we do. And I was writing down some notes, and right as you were saying it, I was saying, I really want to make sure I come back to this point that housing justice is a racial justice issue, and homelessness is a human rights issue, and housing is a human right. And I think that's really, really important and something that just can be said over and over again. So I'm gonna open the floor. If people would prefer to put their questions in the chat, I can read them. If instead you would like to raise your hand, then I can unmute you and you can ask your question to Shams directly. And we'll do like about 10 minutes of questions, and then I'd like for us to break out into small groups for 5 or so minutes, just to have a moment for where we can all reflect with each other and have some conversation.
Tell me someone got some questions.
I think I have a question. Hey Shams, knowing that I have an opportunity to ask you questions many a times, but I want to know, like, because you explained at the age of 12, right, what your experience was like, and then here you are still experiencing not only homelessness, but the impact of having to survive. I want to know, what did you do outside of the use of any type of substance? What did you do to keep yourself alive and thriving and like not giving up? Like knowing that housing is a human right, somewhere along that journey, you knew that you had a right to it. What prevented you from giving up?
Good question. I mean, and being totally transparent and honest, I've been struggling all my life. I've had great moments, and I've experienced having housing and all of that, but more of my life was experienced during the struggle. But I think that, I really look at people like Frederick Douglass. I look at people like Marcus Garvey, and knowing their histories and the times that they lived in and how difficult things were for them, I always had this thing about me that said, look, man, there's people that have it worse. Just push. And when you look at somebody, just take Frederick Douglass, and who became this, coming up from slavery, became this, like Booker T. Washington, and became this great orator. And I just look to their examples and understanding that there are many people who came up out of the slave experience and through the years who have battled these challenges and have done great things. We can applaud them and celebrate them today. So I just held on to that. Sometimes it was extremely difficult. Sometimes it was extremely depressing and distressing. And at some point, I did grow tired of the struggle. I did get to a point where I felt like, I'm done, man. I don't want to do this no more. I wanted to kill myself. I was contemplating suicide. Seriously contemplating. I was watching the trains and saying, just jump. I was walking over the Pulaski Bridge and saying, just jump. But I thought about my children, and I said, oh, how would they deal with that? I thought about my family, the people that care about me, yourself included, and I said, I don't think I could do it like that. But what I did in that distressful point in time is I did reach out for help. And I was fortunate that I knew that there was a program existed called Project Renewal that I didn't understand help. I didn't understand what it's like to, I wasn't saying that there was a psychological issue, there was an emotional issue. I didn't know all that. I just knew there was an issue. But when I asked for help, I was fortunate that through them, I was able to get it. And in getting it, I was able to start to understand that, hey, something is wrong, but it can be fixed. And so because I care so much about my children, I care so much about other people, that I said, you know what, you gotta get your stuff together and you gotta be all right. And so I'll leave you with this, is that after almost dying from COVID, and I described my experience as rising out of the ashes like a phoenix, I made a promise that I would not waste another moment in my life being bitter, feeling like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. If there ain't no light, I'm gonna make it. I'll bust the tunnel up. I don't walk in fear of anything. I move in the spirit of righteousness, of trying to do good. I move in the spirit of trying to use my life and my example, no matter what it's been, to impact people in a positive way. And because I'm moving like that, I'm good. There's no need to end this. And if it was the time for me to end, I'm all right. Because as you can see, each day, each moment, I'm doing good. And that's what really matters to me.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. Well, first and foremost, Shams, thank you so much for not only your courage, but also your leadership and your ability to use your lived experiences to uplift others experiencing the same thing. And thank you for your vulnerability and resharing. We know doing this work for the last 25 years as activists and organizers and those committed to serving, that every time you have to open up and reshare your story and things that have traumatized you, it takes a little bit more out of the human. So just want to first and foremost hold some space for you, that after this evening and having to open up and share all of these things, that the rest of the evening and the rest of the week and the weekend provide you with peace and healing and love and joy, because that is incredibly important in doing this work. I do have a question for you. Very proud to, work alongside of you on many of these things. And as somebody that is interested in using these 25 years in advocacy and organizing and leadership, and expound that and how we can impact people through legislation and policy. My question for you is, when we talk about solutions and how we can drive solutions through policy and legislation, what would be the top 3 priorities that folks who are interested in assuming seats here that serve New York State on a state level, what are 3 top line priorities that we should be focusing on in terms of pressuring legislation and curating legislation as folks who are in that particular arena?
A good question. And just so you know, I just want to acknowledge you. That's Shaniqua Charles. The previous person was William Evans, who runs an excellent organization called Neighborhood Benches. Shaniqua Charles runs Miss Abby Kids. So let me just tell you 3 real quickly. We have a variety of problems here in New York City, and issues and concerns for all New Yorkers. My desire is to see that all New Yorkers' issues and concerns are addressed. We're in the midst, we haven't come out of, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. People are still dying, people still getting sick. So we are still in a crisis moment. And we have to acknowledge that, what may be an issue to me may not be an issue to somebody else, et cetera, because New York is just that diverse city. And as elected officials, we have to take that into consideration, whether we represent a particular district or locality. We have to understand that your district and locality could actually have an effect on the rest of the city. So collectively, I would like to see elected officials or people that are going into office or seeking office to understand the value of working with the entire New York City population to address the issues of concern of all New Yorkers. I don't want a person that's just going to answer to my needs, because there's somebody who their needs don't have nothing to do with my needs, but they need to be addressed too. We don't want a city where we have division and we have people going against each other, as we saw with the experience of the Upper West Side, the men of Lucerne and stuff like that. I was totally not comfortable with that. That's just a little example, but it permeates all throughout New York City. And I want to see in city council, in the assembly districts and the state senators and beyond, I want to see people begin to say that your problem is my problem. I don't care where you live or where you at. Let's come together and see how we can solve the issues that could positively impact the entire New York City. And so, you know, I don't want to veer off, but Shaniqua, I think that some of the pressing issues that I'm seeing is one, of course, housing and homelessness. Those are interrelated. You can't just say homelessness without thinking about housing. Housing and homelessness is one of the major issues. A person without a home, there's no ability to stabilize. There's no ability to be whole. Like, you are at your worst when you have to sleep on those streets or in them subways or in those congregate shelters that I consider to be death traps. Housing and homelessness is a major issue. Public safety is a major issue, but it's not detached from housing and homelessness. They're interrelated. Not that homeless people are the cause for, say, a lack of public safety, but public safety is rooted in health. So when we say public safety, we'll also talk about public health. So we have public safety issues, but we also have a public health issue. People are going through things. People are really bad off because of wealth inequality. Economics has put many people at such a disadvantage that it brings about other type of things as just a means of survival or a mean of coping. And this negatively affects how we move about in this society that has been adverse to our growth and development. So we have to look at these things as being correlated. And when it comes to Black and brown people, I know people don't like to really accept this because we're supposed to be so far beyond that. But it is rooted in systemic, structural, and institutional racism. We're not really seeing anything new if you've been in the experience. It's just done in different ways. But when you look and you see our Haitian brothers and sisters being whipped from people on horsebacks, is that different from what we've dealt with during slavery? It's just another sign that shows you how America has not respected Black and brown people as human beings. And so racial justice is another major issue that needs to be addressed. We are a people who have spent hundreds of years either as slaves, and then as people who were negatively affected by Reconstruction, Roosevelt's New Deals, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, et cetera. And there has been no healing process for that. There has been no reparations for that. And yet still America has codified and codifies our oppression. And so when we talk about Sukkot, when we talk about housing and homelessness, let's understand that what I was challenging in the Lucerne experience is those laws that make it okay for the city to perpetuate systems that allow for us to be in poverty and dependence with no way to rise in in society. So I hope I answered the question, but anybody got another question?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you to the hosts and putting this really, really informative and touching and warm program together to bring enlightenment to Sukkot and all that it means. Just deeply appreciate you and deep gratitude for that. I'll fall back so the next person can ask their question.
Thank you, Shaniqua. If it's okay with you, Shams, I think I'll do some breakout rooms,
Okay.
just so people have like a few minutes just to sort of share any reflections that they had, anything they learned tonight that they are thinking about in small groups. If you felt moved to take any action from what you heard tonight, I think that would be empowering to share. And if you also want to just share some reflections on what you think faith-based communities or faith communities can and should do in the fight for housing justice in our city. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Can I interject something right before we do the breakout groups?
Yeah.
I would want everyone to take into consideration, because I did speak of slavery, right? And the trauma of that experience. And where I think we connect, I could be wrong. I'm learning as we're in real time. But I always think about the Jewish experience. I always think, because this is so recent for us. And I think about the Holocaust and how that has been so devastating to so many people, to all of us, really, to the world. And I want us to embrace our collective experiences and understand why we can come together and why we can connect and basically say, I feel you. I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I appreciate that. That's great. Okay, so I'm gonna keep the rooms relatively small so that people have hopefully just a couple minutes to talk about some of that. And then I think we'll come back with just a couple minutes left to wrap up and share any final thoughts. So we'll have about 5 or 6 minutes in the breakout rooms. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Does anyone want to just share any brief reflection that came up? We probably only have time for one. So any brave soul wants to share any reflections or thoughts that came up in their breakout rooms?
Wait a minute, come on, somebody gotta speak. Somebody, come on now.
Go ahead, Beryl. Oh,
Well,
sorry.
I was in a breakout session with Kay, and I don't remember her name. Oh, Celia, a young, a 14-year-old, I think, who's actually had some experience with you, Sham, but I had never met you before, and I have to say I was really impressed by you and everything you've done for, you know, your whole adult life, even before your adult life started. So it's a real, I mean, housing in the city is, I would say, the #1 priority. And I don't know how it's, I think it's something we all have to be proactive about, and pressure on our new mayor and new city government. So that's.
Thank you.
Celia, would you like to say anything? I'm so honored to have you amongst us.
It's really great hearing you again. For those who don't know, I went to middle school at Booker T, and I was a part of Model UN there. And our topic for the year was homelessness and housing. So we worked really closely with Shams, and he spoke to us for a couple hours one night about his whole life story. And it's just, he's been such an inspiration to me. And everything you do, Shams, is just really so incredible. So thank you.
Thank you. You know that you and your fellow delegates are my leaders. And one of the main reasons why I continue and I go on is because of you. And I'm so appreciative of you and your support as well.
Thank you, Cecilia. And thank you, Beryl. And thank you, Shams. We are at time tonight. I don't even know where the time went. I feel like we could have listened to you a lot longer, Shams. I think we could have talked more amongst ourselves. And so I think that's a good place to leave, because it means we know there's more work to do and more conversation to be had within our community and within the broader community of our city. And I really hope that everyone here will be part of those conversations going forward, and certainly show up to the calls to action and the conversations that we'll have in the months and years to come around housing justice and homelessness in our city. So I'm going to put my email in the chat as promised at the beginning. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any thoughts or reflections or questions after tonight's event about anything we discussed. And I'm happy to pass along messages to Shams as well. Shams, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing so much of yourself and your experiences with our community. It's so important. And I'm just, every time I hear you, I'm blown away. And I'm just really grateful that we could have you here tonight with us. Thank you to Shuli and to Kay also for sharing some learning and a history with all of us. And have a good night, everybody.
Good night. I love you all.